This week is week 2 in a series called Reactions Speak Louder Than Words. So if you weren't here last week, I'm going to catch you up a little bit. Last week, we talked about the power of the over-under reaction, okay? Something that we think is set out for us in Scripture as an example of how we should react to the world, okay? And I gave you a little bit of homework. I asked you to work on this in your homes. I wonder if anybody actually did their homework last week. If you want to proudly say, okay, Russ did his homework, man, and Aaron did his homework. It's amazing. Okay, 2 people did your homework. Guys, if this was an elementary school class, I would have stern words for you. But it's church, and I love you. But I'll just encourage you. This is how Canadians are led anyway. I'll encourage you maybe to think about doing something about it. This week, I did my homework. What I asked you to do was think of something that generally or often perturbs, disturbs, or upsets you, and to find a way to think about what your normal reaction is to that thing. Something that, quote unquote, sets you off, and then come up with a way to react to it differently. To think through, like moms and dads, what would it look like if you reacted to your children in such a way that they wondered if you were really their parents? Or kids, if you're still in here, what would make your mom and dad go, who are you and what did you do with my son or daughter? Right? We all have things that tend to set us off, okay? What would amazing and unprecedented look like as it relates to our reactions? I told you what my homework was last week, right? Do you remember this? I said that I don't, somebody said no, that's how it goes. We get up here, we talk, and people don't remember. Okay, so it's fine. It's good. We're all good. Listen, my homework last week was this. I don't love to run errands, period. Especially, though, when those errands come across my plate at the end of my workday. Does anybody else get this from their partner, their significant other, somebody in their family? They know it's like 4:45 and you're about to leave the office. And they'll send you a text, right? That says, hey, on your way home, can you stop and pick up X, Y, or Z? Do you guys get texts like that every once in a while? I don't like those texts. And I know that it's my problem. I know that I'm being selfish and childish, and I should respond better. But they just kind of set me off, because at the end of the day, all I want to do is come home. And so most of the time when Melissa asks me this, I will say yes. But you know that not all yeses are made equal, right? And you can tell when you get a yes that isn't really a yes. When you get a yes that's more like, really? Ugh. Okay? So I committed this week that I would respond to requests from Melissa to run errands by saying the following, if we can put that up here. I would be happy to do that, okay? And what I want you to know is that this is a screenshot of a text message that I received from Melissa on Sunday at 12:09 p.m. In other words, before I left the building last week, she was holding me accountable, right? She was going to make sure that the pastor practices what he preaches. And I said to her, I would be happy to do that. And I did. Yes, thank you. This is an important topic, right? Because our actions speak louder than words. We all know that. But our reactions speak even louder. Like your reaction to situations is going to get people to stop and stare at you more often than you like, right? And there's 2 ways that can happen. The first is the overreaction. Moms and dads, you've probably all been there when your kids are misbehaving at the mall and you have just lost it. And you are now trying to get your kids to behave, but they're not listening. And your voice has gotten way louder than it should have in public. And maybe I'm the only one that this happens to, but I don't think that's true. I think it happens to all of us, right? And people at the mall stop and look and like, what's wrong with you, right? But there is an alternative. There is an alternative when things don't go our way. we could practice the art and learn to be people who underreact, right? And we have an opportunity every time we react to a situation that might throw us off to overwhelm people with how well we react to a situation, right? We can throw people the unexpected, counterintuitive, remarkable power of an over-under reaction to whatever situation it is for you. We all have different trigger points, right? We all have different things or people or phrases that will throw us off. And we all have the opportunity to over-under react and to have people react to us much in the same way that they did to Jesus, because Jesus is our example. He is the master of the over-under reaction. That's what we're going to look at this morning. How he reacted to us in such a way that made people stop and go, what happened there? That cause did not warrant that effect, right? Like Jesus was constantly underreacting to situations, to things that people did to him that we would probably be wildly offended by. Jesus seemed to have this ability to not overreact, but to overreact. In fact, it's exactly the way that the Bible talks about his reaction to us, right? You know, so what the Bible says is that people have acted in such a way that God has the right to be offended by us. That we have done things that hurt him, that displease him, you know? And in the way the world works, one could easily expect for God to have returned evil for evil in that respect. In fact, a lot of the stories about other gods throughout history, you know, think about the Roman pantheon or the Greek pantheon for a second. You know, these gods, they were terrible. They were awful. They were constantly doing terrible things to human beings. But the Bible tells a much, much different story about God, that he reacted to us in love when we were evil towards him. God did not return our evil for evil, right? These are some of the verses we looked at last week. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Why? God has a purpose in us learning to react this way so that you may be children of your Father in heaven, right? We're all kind of aware that the people in our families, especially our children, have a reflection on who we are. The Bible calls us to learn to reflect well on our Heavenly Father, right? Jesus continues, if you love those who love you, what recognition do you get? Right? The scriptures are actually looking for us to get some recognition for the way that we behave. And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Next slide, Josh. Right? Like God has an intention in our actions and reactions. And it's not just to reflect God, right? But it also says something, and this is what we want to talk about today. This is what we want to dive into today here. It says something about how confident we are in what God is doing in the world. Or it could have the opposite effect. It could speak to how we lack confidence in what God is doing in the world. You know? When do we tend to overreact? Think about this for a quick second. When do you tend to overreact? You tend to overreact when things are out of your control, right? When things go out of our control, that's when we tend, like we're all used to behaving when things go the right way. Our actions are fine as long as we get what we expect to get. But when things go out of our control, this is when reactions come out of us that we maybe aren't in control of, don't expect. And it says something about what's going on inside of us. And if you're a believer in Jesus, right, there is actually some level of obligation to actually manage your reactions. Because what you want to do, what you've been called to do, right, is to have confidence in God and to reflect that confidence in the way that you interact with the world around you. Which, the opposite is true, by the way. If you're here and you're not yet a follower of Jesus, welcome. Like, we assume there are people here all the time who have doubts and questions, haven't made a decision about Jesus. We're so glad that you trusted somebody enough to come here this morning. And the good news for you is you are not obligated to behave this way. If you're not a follower of Jesus, there's no obligation for you to actually do anything that I'm going to talk about. Okay? So permission granted to not. But I would say that if you're here and that's the kind of person that you are and that's where you are in your spiritual journey, there's a lot to be gained by being a person who's in control of your reactions. So maybe we tune in anyway. Maybe we dial in together just to see how things go. Let me tell you a little story about something that happened in our family before I keep going. Because it stands out as a moment when I was shown the power of an underreaction. So I grew up, my dad had the same job that I have. My dad was a pastor at a church in the eastern part of Canada, which is Nova Scotia, not Ontario, by the way. For all you Westerners, let me give you a geography lesson. Ontario's in the center of Canada, and there's a whole 5 provinces past there that are part of, Quebec's not really, but, the Maritime provinces, right? Like part of eastern Canada. Quebec is its own deal, and so is Ontario, for that matter. But then there's these 4 quaint, beautiful little provinces out on the East Coast. That's Eastern Canada, in case you've forgotten. Don't call Ontario Eastern Canada. It's not Eastern Canada. It's Central Canada. Okay, so I grew up in Eastern Canada, right, in Nova Scotia. My dad was a pastor. And I hope you've never had this experience, but if you hang around churches long enough, sometimes you figure out that churches, sometimes they get naughty. Sometimes they don't treat each other the way that Jesus asks us to treat each other. Sometimes they fight and they have problems. And I'm sure that's never going to happen here. But it happens from time to time in churches. And it happened in my dad's church. And 3 of the guys that he worked most closely with, that he would have considered his best friends, called his boss and tried to get him fired. And what stands out about that situation for me, like imagine if that happened to you. What would your reaction be? If your coworkers went ahead and tattled on you for the purposes of getting you fired, how would you feel? What would you say? What would you do? How would you treat those people? And I'm guessing, because I put myself in this category, there's a potential not very well. And I remember from that era, never ever having an ill will personally towards any of those people that were treating my dad so poorly. And as I've gotten older, I've realized it's because my dad never talked about it at home. My dad never tried to throw those people under the bus. He never tried to defame them, right? He underreacted to the situation. Because I think if it happened to me, I'd be talking about it all the time. I'd be trying to find people to sympathize with me. I'd be trying to find people to join my party. And I think it came from Dad's absolute confidence that God was in control of the situation. If God wants me to be here, I'll be here. And if God doesn't want me to be here, I won't be here. And I wonder in your life what it looks like, what it sounds like to express that level of confidence that God is in control. What does it look like for you? What does it sound like for you? Next slide, Josh. Next one again. Here's what it looked like for Jesus to express that level of confidence in God. This story that we're going to look at this morning comes from Luke, the Gospel of Luke. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. One of the first 4 stories about Jesus in the New Testament. And here's what it says. It says, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. Why is that important? Because what we know now is that Jesus knew everything that was about to happen to him as he moved towards Jerusalem. He knew there were enemies there. He knew they wanted harm for him. He knew that he was probably going to die if he went to Jerusalem. In fact, he took quite a while to actually turn his attention there and go to Jerusalem, precisely because he knew what was going to happen. And he had some work he wanted to do and some things that needed to be accomplished. But when it was time, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. And he sent messengers out ahead of him, right, to see if they could get some place to stay in a Samaritan village. Okay, so we figured that there were probably a crowd of people following Jesus, not just him and the 12 disciples, but a larger crowd as well. And so just like you make reservations at a hotel or a restaurant when you go, Jesus was trying to make some reservations in the next town. Do you have room to accommodate us? But it's very important to know that it was a Samaritan town because Jesus was Jewish and all of his followers were Jewish, and the Samaritans and the Jews did not get along. At that point in history, they were not getting along. They had this fundamental disagreement about where you should worship God, right? And so there were two hills, around about the same area. One was called Mount Gerizim, and one was called Mount Moriah. And the Jews believed that you worship God on Mount Moriah, and the Samaritans believed that you would worship God on Mount Gerizim. And that created a whole lot of hubbub and hullabaloo. If you've been around, religion for any stretch of time, you may have seen people come up with disagreements about slightly silly things. This was a disagreement about a slightly silly thing, okay? Here's what it says. The people there in that town, that Samaritan town, did not welcome him because he was headed for Jerusalem, okay? So it doesn't say this, but the implication is because he was a Jew, they didn't welcome him, okay? So when his disciples, James and John, saw this, pause there for a second. We've talked a lot about John here over the last number of months, okay? We studied the book of John. He showed up in a couple of sermons I did just a little while ago when we were talking about the nature of, masculinity and manhood. John was the first guy who wrote down for us that God is love, okay? John is often seen as a poet. He's often seen as a beautiful writer, okay? And so it's funny to consider that John who wrote God is love, and what he suggests that they do. When the disciples James and John saw this behavior towards Jesus, they asked him, Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven and destroy them? It seems like a wild overreaction, doesn't it? Like, hey, we don't have room at our hotel to accommodate you. Let's go burn it down. Right? Sorry, we don't have any room for your reservation at the restaurant tonight. That's cool. I'm going to bring my blowtorch and set it on fire. Right? And Jesus' reaction is awesome. The Bible is constantly because it's not written to us, right? It's not written in our language, so we miss things. Okay, so it says Jesus turned and rebuked them. But it's a whole lot more like Jesus turned around and went, you idiots. No, of course we're not going to burn it down. Rebuke is the word that it uses when Jesus talked about rebuking demons, like evil creatures and evil forces. It's the same word that he used for that, which means he was using very aggressive language with the disciples over this crazy overreaction that they want to have. Of course we're not going to burn it down. Have you been listening to anything I said over the last 3 or 3.5 years? Like, what about what I have said to you makes you think that I would burn this village down? Because here's the thing, like all this stuff that we've been talking about over the last couple of weeks, and these words of Jesus about turning the other cheek and not repaying eye for an eye, and this new ethic and ethos that Jesus was teaching in what we call the Sermon on the Mount. It's recorded for us twice. Its most complete form is Matthew chapter 5 through 7. It's also in Luke a bit. Now here's the thing. It's recorded for us in such a way that for a long time when I read it, I was like, oh, this is a one-time thing that Jesus said. And somebody was there and they wrote it down. But actually what we believe is that Jesus gave that sermon many, many times as he traveled around the region. I think this was very smart of Jesus, and actually he was quite fortunate. Because being somebody who has to write a new speech for a half hour every single week of the year, it would be very convenient for me just to come and tell you all the same talk week after week after week. It's way less work. It's way less work. Jesus had this core message that he took everywhere he went. This was what Jesus was trying to get people to become. The Sermon on the Mount is not just a nice talk Jesus gave one time. It is the ethic and ethos of his entire life and ministry recorded for us. You want to know what Jesus was looking for in the world? Go read the Sermon on the Mount again and again and again and again. Because that's how Jesus delivered it over and over and over. And what the disciples seem to have missed here is that they had spent 3.5 years not just listening to Jesus say it, but watching him apply his teaching to his own life, right? And so what we see as Jesus enters Jerusalem and moves towards the cross is the continuation of him living out this ethic that he's been teaching people. Here's what it says. Then he and his disciples went to another village. Jesus just decided, hey guys, like there's a way better reaction here. We're not going to burn it down. We'll just go find someplace else to stay, right? Super easy. Then as Jesus enters, right, we know what happens. We know that the religious leaders get after Jesus. They arrest him, right? They take him to Pilate, okay? Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor in Jerusalem at the time, okay? And the religious leaders, the Jewish religious leaders, ask Pilate to crucify Jesus, okay? Pilate doesn't see any reason why he should be crucifying Jesus. He doesn't understand why they're asking him for such a overreaction to what Jesus has done. So Pilate comes up with a solution. He's like, well, maybe if I just punish Jesus somewhat, then they'll be satisfied with that, right? So Pilate sends Jesus off for a flogging. Okay? And understand, this isn't just like getting hit with sticks or something like that. They used a whole bunch of implements that would cut Jesus. And when Jesus comes back to Pilate, essentially, he's close to death. He's bleeding out in front of Pilate. And this is what it says about how Jesus reacted to Pilate. This is the lesson we need to learn. Pilate says to Jesus, "Do you refuse to speak to me?" And says to Jesus, "Do you not realize I have the power either to free you or to crucify you?" Right? It's Pilate's decision. In Pilate's mind, I can do what I want here. I don't want to kill you, but do you not understand? If you don't interact with me, I have the power to do whatever I decide to do to you. And Jesus' response is so amazing. He says, you have no power if it wasn't given to you from above. You have no power that wasn't given to you by God. In other words, Jesus was expressing this unshakable confidence in the fact that God was in control of how things were going to turn out. Whatever happened next wasn't up to Pilate. It wasn't even up to Jesus. It was up to his Father in heaven. And whatever came next, Jesus is saying, it's okay. I trust my Father. How hard must that have been? How unbelievably difficult must it have been while he is bleeding out? He's already close to death. And to say to this man who's used to having people bow before him and treat him like a king, you have no power that wasn't given to you by my Father. And look what the scriptures say. I think this is so fun. From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free. He tried. He did his best to set him free. Pilate did not want to be. I feel bad for Pilate. I think he gets a bad rap, but it seems as though Pilate was not a very willing participant in all of this. Now, he deserves some critique because eventually he gives people what they want, even though it's evil. But it's interesting to see how Pilate was just not keen to give them what they wanted. He tried to set Jesus free, but he didn't have the power to do so. And so, eventually, Pilate gives in, sends Jesus to be crucified. And even then, as Jesus is there, hanging from a cross, this is what it says about that moment when they hurled their insults at him. He did not retaliate. These are words penned for us by Peter a little later in the New Testament, right? And what's important to see here is that Peter has gone through a wild transformation, right? Because remember Peter, if you haven't heard this, Peter was confronted, hey, are you one of Jesus' followers? And Peter, in the moments when Jesus was being crucified, said, no, I am not. He denies Jesus multiple times, but stood and watched what happened. And so from Peter's point of view, this is what he says about that moment. They hurled insults at him, and he did not retaliate. And when he suffered, he made no threats. In fact, we know that Jesus, hanging there on that cross, says, "Father, forgive all of these people, for they have no idea what they're doing." Even in the worst moment of his life that deserved the most dramatic reaction, Jesus was true to what he asked everybody else to be true to. Trust God. Don't overreact. Somebody bigger than you and me has this under control. And when we choose to trust God, he gives us freedom. It's an incredible irony or a sadness in our world that I see so many people who are stuck in the same place because they've chosen to give power over their future to somebody who hurt them in the past. Do you know anybody like this? Somebody who has been wounded, and I'm not minimizing the pain that they're going through in any way, shape, or form. But so often people are encountered with the opportunity to say, there is a future that is better than the past that I could ever hope for. But we're reluctant to go there. We're reluctant to try it. We're reluctant to take a few steps away from the pain that we've experienced, and we're stuck. Because in that moment, we believe somebody else has more power than God. In that moment, we are behaving as though that person who wounded me gets to determine my future. The only person who can determine your future, who has ultimate power to set you free, is Jesus. And he proved it when he went to the cross and he came back to life. And we see it in the lives of the people around him. Jesus, this is what Peter, how he kind of encapsulates this. Jesus, instead of making these insults and hurling and overreacting, Jesus entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. And when we give our hope, we set our gaze on God, he gives us the ability to be free. You have no power over me, Jesus said to Pilate. What a wild thing to say. What a wild thing to say to a king. To stand in the presence of the most powerful person any of these people will ever encounter. You have no power over me. And all of this, right? Peter can come back and say this because what Peter saw was not just a man who he denied, who went to a cross and who died. Peter saw a man come back to life through the power of God. And in that sense, Peter had every reason to take every slight, criticism, hurt, and turn it into the opportunities that he had to help other people find a relationship with God. And the same is true for all of us. The power that raised Jesus from the dead is the same power that God wants to have live in you. That's what the scriptures tell us. A huge part of the opportunity to do that, to help other people see that there is a God and to know freedom in his name, is our ability to master the underreaction. To become so confident in what God is up to that we would not overreact, lose control, because what's inside of us, right? What's inside of us is not a trust and faith in us. What's inside of us is not our own limitations, our weaknesses. What's inside of us can be the power of God that raised Jesus from the dead. And out of that center, we do not have to overreact. We can become masters of the over-under reaction, right? And this is what it means. Let me reinforce this. This is what it means to follow Jesus. This is what it means to follow Jesus. This is what it should look like to be a Christian. Sometimes I find that word is difficult. It comes with so much baggage these days. Like, what does it mean to be a Christian in today's world? There are a lot of competing views of what it means to be a Christian. But I think the most simple thing is to determine whether somebody is actually following Jesus. Like, are they taking regular steps to behave like Jesus, to look like Jesus, to think like Jesus, to love like Jesus? And if somebody doesn't match that ethic, it doesn't matter what you call them. They probably aren't a representative of Jesus, because Jesus didn't call us, first and foremost, to come. Like, when Jesus came and he found his disciples, he didn't say, believe in me. He said, follow me. Walk with me. Become like me. And it's the call, the opportunity that we're all given. So, here's what I want to ask this week. For those of you who are on the path following Jesus, or maybe just curious about it, you know, Jesus does say that we can the scriptures invite us to taste and see that the Lord is good. What does that mean? It means that, like, you can actually put things into practice long before you believe that they're true. And you can see that it works. That God has a design for the world that works. So here's my challenge to everyone. Whether you are a follower of Jesus or not this morning, you can do this. Go out into the wild. Okay, last week I said don't try this on your coworkers yet. You're not ready. Okay, don't try it right away. Okay, practice at home. Only 2 of you did. So, or at least by show of hands. So look, maybe it's at home. But, you know, there are lots of other opportunities to do this too, right? There are lots of opportunities for you to show the power of an underreaction in the world, right? You are going to be confronted this week by somebody outside your home that's going to annoy you. And if you're not, can you tell me how you did it? Because it happens to me every week. You know, like, somebody is going to try to bring a reaction up out of you. At some point this week, you're going to have an opportunity to choose to put faith in something bigger than you that has control of how the outcomes are going to work out, right? And this is what I would love for you to do this week, is to pre-decide now. Think about it. Think ahead, because you probably know who it is, right? You probably know what your triggers are, right? It's a fancy word we use all the time in our culture. What are your triggers? Some of your triggers are the things that need to come under this set of rules and regulations, right? You have to put this into practice to defeat your triggers. Otherwise, your triggers are just going to own you. So what are your triggers? What are the things? Who are the people? Where are the places? You know, is there a particularly annoying Starbucks employee that always gets your goat? You know? Is there somebody at your work? Is there a customer that you're going to have to deal with this week that just knows how to get under your skin? Think about it ahead of time. Pre-decide now who's in control. Pre-decide now who you are going to trust. Right? And be like Peter. Instead, we entrust ourselves. Instead of trusting ourselves, we entrust ourselves to him who judges justly.